So for contracts or obligations ex contractu, those that arise from stipulations of the parties. Hence, there's a meeting of the minds or there's a formal agreement. In this one, it must be complied with in good faith because it is the law between the parties and no one or neither party may unilaterally evade his obligation in the contract. Of course, there are some exemptions. One is when the contract authorizes the evasion of the obligation, and another one if the other party assents thereto. Always remember that the parties may freely stipulate any statement in their contract, provided that it's not contrary to law, morals, good customs, public order, or public policy. A contract has three elements: the consent of two parties, the object or the subject matter, and the consideration. For example, on January 1, 2020, a contract of lease was executed between Nico as the lessee and Peter as the lessor for the rent of a two-story apartment in Tanza, Tuguegarao City. Here, the contract of lease entered into between Peter and Nico has the force of law between them. It does not mean, however, that itong kontratang ito are over and above the law. Okay? Contracts are with limitations imposed by law in Article 306 of the New Civil Code. If, however, this two-story apartment was converted to a drug den or to a bahay pasugalan by the lessee Nico, then it shall now be considered as a violation on their agreement because it is considered to be contrary to law, morals, good customs, public order, and public policy. 1116. Quasi-contracts. There are two types of quasi-contracts. It may be considered to be negotiatorium gestio or solutio indebiti. Quasi-contracts or obligation ex quasi-contractu are those that arise from lawful, voluntary, and unilateral acts and which are enforceable to the end that no one shall be unjustly enriched or benefited at the expense of another. The first one is the negotiatorium gestio. Negotiatorium gestio is also known as the unauthorized management. This takes place when a person voluntarily takes charge of another's business or property without the owner's authority. For example, Victor is a wealthy landowner. He left for abroad, leaving his livestock farm unattended. Due to lockdown, Victor was not able to return on time. Ramon, ang kapitbahay ni Victor, saw that the chickens are already suffering. He then voluntarily managed the farm by buying some feeds and vitamins amounting to 20,000 pesos. When Victor returns, he has now the obligation to reimburse Ramon for the expenses incurred by him, and of course to pay for his services. This is based on the principle that no one shall unjustly enrich himself at the expense of another. Kung mapapansin ninyo, here there is an unauthorized management. However, Ramon voluntarily takes charge of Victor's business or property without the knowledge of Victor. Solution indebiti or the undue payment. This takes place when something is received when there is no right to demand it and it was unduly delivered through mistake. For example, Arvin owed Ian the sum of 1,000 pesos. By mistake, Arvin paid 2,000 pesos. Ian now has the obligation to return the excess money or the excess 1,000 pesos because there was a payment by mistake. 1161, this talks about the civil obligations arising from criminal offenses. Delicts or those that acts or omissions punishable by the revised penal code may result for a civil liability. It may be a restitution, reparation, or indemnification. Restitution is the returning or the restoration of the object of the crime to the injured party. Ito yung pagbabalik mo nung nawalang item doon sa injured party. While reparation is the payment of the offender of the value of the object of the crime when such object can no longer be returned. Kung hindi mo na maibabalik yung bagay na nawala, you can pay the amount or the value of the object through reparation. While indemnification is the consequential damages. So, ibig sabihin nito is consequential damages or in addition to the said liability. For example, Mario and Rito are drinking buddies. And isang gabi, one night, they were having their inuman session. Rito, pinagmamayabang niya yung binigay na gold wristwatch ng kanyang mayamang na mayapan na lolo. Mario, walang trabaho dahil sa COVID, ninakaw niya yung relo ni Rito. Since Rito was dead drunk, lasing na lasing si Rito, si Mario intentionally stole the wristwatch of Rito. Rito then filed a case against Mario. On February 1, 2019, Mario was convicted and sentenced to imprisonment by the court for the crime of theft. In addition to imprisonment, the question is, what may the court impose? The answer is, first one, ibalik muna natin yung tanong, may ibabalik pa ba yung relo? If yes, then restitution can be imposed against Mario in addition to imprisonment. Paano kung hindi naman maibabalik yung relo? Then, if restitution is no longer possible, then Mario should pay the value of the gold wristwatch, or this is called the reparation. Assuming that the value of the wristwatch is 50,000 pesos, then Mario should pay 50,000 pesos in addition to imprisonment. Paano naman, ma'am, may dagdag pa ba? Yes, that is indemnification. If si Rito nagsuffer, for example, since bigay ito ng lolo niya na favorite siya at meron ng sentimental value yung relo na to, then indemnification can be a consequential damages to such liability. Another one is QUASI-DELICTS or TORTS. QUASI-DELICTS or TORTS is also known as obligation ex quasi delicto or quasi maleficio. These arise from damage caused to another through an act or omission, there being no fault or negligence, but there is no contractual relation exists between the parties. For example, while Pedro is driving on his way to work, he received a text message from his boss to rush a report. So late na si Pedro, binilisan niyang mag-drive. Feeling intense, he replied to his boss while driving. Nag-reply siya habang nag-detect siya habang nagda-drive. So Pedro suddenly swerved to his right, hitting Jose, who is walking on the sidewalk of the street, inflicting him physical injuries. Question, is Pedro liable? Yes, Pedro is liable. Because here, Pedro caused damage to another by fault or negligence. Texting while driving is negligence. By reason of such negligence, Pedro now is liable to pay for the damage done against Juan. Also, there is no pre-existing contractual relationship between the parties. Article 1162. Obligations derived from quasi-delicts. Quasi-delicts is also known as culpa aquiliana. It is an act or omission by a person which causes damage to another, giving rise to an obligation to pay for the damage done. There being fault or negligence, but there is also no pre-existing contractual relations between the parties. Here, these are the requisites. Ito, basahin nyo na lang yung mga differences. Yan. So, that ends for part 1.